You were one who got to be in the briefing today to find out what this is really all about. What did you learn from Marco Rubio and the other members of the cabinet who were in that briefing?
Well, I think many of us on the Democratic side certainly left with more questions than answers. We pressed Secretary Rubio and others about the plan moving forward and what exactly Donald Trump meant when he said that we, meaning the Trump administration, presumably, were running Venezuela. When what's clear is that Donald Trump and the administration can't even run the United States of America and keep the promises that they made to the American people, including promising to lower the high cost of living on day one, when we know that's been a disaster. Costs aren't going down, they're going up. Life is more expensive under Donald Trump and his policies and his Trump tariffs. Now, the American people, we made clear, are not interested in seeing American boots on the ground, our men and women in uniform, put in harm's way as part of whatever scheme Donald Trump and his administration are executing relative to Venezuela or any other place. And so one of the things that we're going to have to do, Lawrence, here in the Congress is to act immediately to make clear that no further military action can take place without explicit congressional approval.
So Marco Rubio has said publicly that he thought this is the kind of operation where you just can't follow the rules. You just can't give any prior notice, no matter how secretly, to anyone in Congress.
We pressed them on that, and in fact, the administration, though they've said that their concern is that if they communicate anything to Congress, even a subset of congressional leaders, the problem is that information is going to leak. But I explicitly asked them to give us a single example of them communicating with members of the Gang of Eight or other high-level members of congressional leadership, and that information then becoming public, and the response was crickets. Lawrence, they had no answer because there's no example of it. And we're going to continue to make the case, of course, that the Constitution is not a mere inconvenience in the United States of America. It needs to be followed. And Congress explicitly was given the sole authority to declare war and therefore to authorize acts of military aggression that have all of the indicia of an act of war.
What did you hear from Marco Rubio or anyone else from the administration in that briefing that they have not said publicly?
Well, you know, we're not at liberty, of course, to reveal many of the details that were discussed because it was a highly classified briefing. But suffice is to say that many of us, I don't think, were persuaded that the justification that has been articulated publicly by the administration, that this was a law enforcement operation that had anything to do, you know, with keeping the American people safe. We weren't persuaded by, you know, that argument because they can't explain in clear terms how this helps the national security of the American people in any way, shape, or form. You broke down the indictment. I know others are going to talk about it. This is the same administration that, of course, just pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who's one of the largest narco traffickers in the world, who was sentenced after being found guilty of narco trafficking of epic proportions, flooding the country with more than 400 tons of cocaine, then sentenced to 45 years of hard time in a federal prison. Donald Trump pardons him just a few weeks ago, and they now want the country to believe that this unprecedented military action in Venezuela is about narco trafficking. Of course it's not. It does appear to be about oil, and I can tell you that there was a lot of conversation, we've heard this publicly as well, about oil and American access to that oil and being able to control it, but still nothing that was discussed as it relates to how the life of everyday Americans is going to be made any better.
What did you come out of it with an understanding of what the administration's next step is in Venezuela?
Well, we pressed the administration on this very point, and there's a lack of clarity as it relates to the situation. Of course, the Chavez regime remains in place, and in many ways, and the Maduro folks who've taken over the last several years, they remain in place, including the vice president, who's now apparently at least the titular head of the regime at this moment. And how that makes life better for the Venezuelan people is unclear. The one thing that we'll continue to point out is that the future of Venezuela should be determined by the people of Venezuela, not by Stephen Miller, God forbid, or any other member of the Trump administration, notwithstanding what Donald Trump is talking about. But there's no real plan that we've heard from the Trump administration as to how to ensure that the Venezuelan people will actually get self-determination, the self-determination that they certainly deserve.
Was there any form of confusion, between, say, the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, CIA Director, people in the room? Was there an indication that they, as a group, didn't know what was happening next?
Well, you know, most of the jurisdiction in terms of what comes next does fall within the portfolio of the Secretary of State. And so when we pressed him repeatedly on what comes next, you know, there was just a lack of clarity because, of course, there's a great deal of uncertainty. There's chaos that could be unleashed in Venezuela. There are competing forces who are battling for power in the vacuum that was left as a result of, you know, Maduro now being apprehended. And look, Maduro's a bad guy, and he oppressed the Venezuelan people. He was not legitimately elected. That election in 2024, we know, was stolen. But when it comes to actually having a plan to put the people of Venezuela in the best possible position moving forward, it doesn't exist. And that's problematic. And that's why when you take these type of military actions, but you're not thinking through what comes next, we've seen this turn into a disaster. That certainly was the case in Iraq. And the American people don't want to see that type of foreign policy disaster happen ever again.